Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for Chapter 11 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maikaru continued to tap his wooden rod on the floor. Matty realized he was setting a tempo for the practice bout. Suddenly, Damone took half a pace forward and darted his sword out at Cassandra, chest high. Cassandra brought her sword forward and moved its tip in a small circle, catching the blade of Damone's weapon and deflecting it to one side with a circular motion. Recovering quickly, Damone lunged once more. The katana moved in the opposite direction now, deflecting his wooden blade to the other side. Then, as he was slightly off balance, Cassandra leapt forward and delivered 3 rapid cuts at him. He took the first 2 on his shield, then narrowly managed to block the third, a horizontal sweep at thigh level with his own sword. The crack of their swords as they came together echoed in the armory hall. They stepped apart, resumed their ready positions, and eyed each other carefully. Maikaru increased the tempo with the wooden rod on the floor. "Begin," he said. This time, Cassandra was the first to attack. She swept forward, her wooden blade flashing in the air. A series of staccato cracks marked its impact with Damone's sword and shield. The young warrior backed away, defending desperately against the ever-changing direction and blurring speed of Cassandra's onslaught. Cassandra pursued him down the length of the armory hall, their feet shuffling and squeaking on the floorboards. But even though she was driving Damone back, she could find no gap in his defenses. His sword or shield blocked her cuts, overhead, side-on, and even sweeping up from knee height. Sometimes he only managed to get his sword or shield into position at the last moment, but he managed nevertheless. Cassandra, knowing that speed was her best weapon, continued the assault, searching for an opening, seeking a relaxation in his defense. She didn't find one. Eventually, Maikaru cried, "Enough!" The 2 combatants lowered their swords and stepped back. Both were breathing heavily from their exertions and from the flood of adrenaline that coursed through their bodies. They eyed each other balefully. There was no room for friendship in this contest. They were practicing for war. The time might come when such a competition was a matter of life and death. Maikaru had dinned into their brains the basic message of weapons practice. "Practice as you mean to fight," he had told them. No quarter, no sporting gestures, just a single-minded dedication to winning the bout. Here, losing might mean a painful bruise. In a real battle, the result would be death. "Come," Maikaru said to them, pointing to the floor in front of him. They made their way back from the end of the hall, where Cassandra had driven Damone, and stood attentively before him. Cassandra wiped perspiration from her forehead with the sleeve of her padded jacket. The jacket was stained and grimy, and Matty wondered if the armorers even thought to launder them. Maikaru frowned, studying the princess for several seconds, then spoke. "Your speed is excellent. You gave your opponent no time to begin his own attack." Damone nodded agreement. "She's wickedly fast. Several times there, I barely managed to get my sword or shield in position in time." Maikaru looked at him, his dark eyes steady and unblinking. "Yet manage you did," he said simply, and Damone shrugged. The swordmaster turned his attention back to Cassandra. "You see, my lady," he said, "your speed is your best weapon, but the longer a combat lasts, the more it will be reduced. You become tired. Your arms are heavy. The katana, once so light and easy to wield, begins to weigh down your arms so that the muscles ache." He paused and raised an interrogative eyebrow at her. "That's a pretty good description of the way I feel," she admitted. He nodded. "Your speed and agility are not infinite resources," he said. "They only serve you for a certain time. They begin to deteriorate. And then," he emphasized the word heavily, "your opponent's greater strength and force become the dominant factors in your fight. Cassandra frowned, but Maikeru held up his hand to stop her. When you are facing a skilled opponent like Demon-san, you must find a way to end the bout quickly, before his advantages, his weight, his strength, and his power become the dominant ones. Well, I was trying to do that, Cassandra said, her face reddening a little. Maddie noticed. Her mother had always had a quick temper, as Maddie knew only too well. You were trying the same thing over and over, Maikeru told her. If it didn't work the first time, why should it work on subsequent attempts? But you've told me that speed is my best weapon, Cassandra said, an argumentative tone in her voice. Maikeru nodded. But not your only weapon. Demon-san found a way to counteract your speed, and to make you waste your energy against his defenses until you became tired, and your speed was diminished. When this happens, you must look for something unexpected. Otherwise, as the bout goes on, it becomes more certain that he will be the victor. Unexpected, Cassandra repeated. What do you mean by that? Remember your three best allies: speed, agility, and surprise. Faced with a foe like this, you have to surprise him before it's too late. Your overhand, side cut, and diagonal cuts were not fast enough to break his defense. Look for something else. Such as? Cassandra asked. Damone and Maddie watched keenly, sensing that this was a new plateau in the Princess Regent's swordsmanship. One example might be a single-handed thrust, Maikeru told her quietly. She opened her mouth to speak, stopped, and thought. Then she said slowly, But you say I must always fight two-handed. Before she had finished, Maikeru was shaking his head. There is no always, he told her. You must be ready to change, to adapt, to try something new and unexpected. In a sudden blur of motion, he dropped the wooden rod and drew his own katana from its scabbard. Then he lunged forward, holding it in one hand, the single cutting edge facing upward. The point stopped a bare 2 centimeters from the startled Cassandra's face. Instantly, in a continuation of his first movement, Maikeru withdrew the weapon and resheathed it. He bowed an apology to Cassandra. She waved it aside, looking at him with renewed interest. By using one hand, you increase your reach by almost half a meter, he said. This alone will take your opponent by surprise, as well as the fact that most of your attacks to this moment have been with the edge, not the point. He paused to see if she was following. She nodded. It's a risky move for you, because it leaves you open to a counterattack. You must be ready to recover instantly if the thrust doesn't go home. Again, Cassandra nodded. Then she gestured at the sword in its scabbard. You reversed your wrist so that the cutting edge was uppermost, she said. What was the reason for that? Maikeru nodded approvingly. You notice small details, he said. That's good. He drew his sword again, more slowly this time, and demonstrated the reversed wrist position with the cutting edge on top. The katana's blade had a slight curve, imparting a downward direction to the thrust. By reversing my wrist, I make the point of the katana travel slightly downward because of the curved blade. That means the sharp cutting edge can shear more easily through your opponent's chainmail. The edge is sharp enough to do that, he added. Cassandra nodded, eyes narrowed, as she studied the gleaming blade. I see, she said slowly. Practice it with me, Maikeru told her. He stood beside her, demonstrating how to progress from an obliquely angled cut into the thrust, releasing the left hand from the grip, turning the wrist, and stepping forward, all in one smooth movement. Cassandra copied the sequence several times, gradually moving faster and faster. As her movements became more confident, Maikeru stepped away, resheathing his katana and watching her closely. He bent and retrieved his wooden rod and began to tap a tempo on the floor once more. Then, with his free hand, he gestured down the length of the hall. Move, he instructed her. and change to the thrust every 3 strokes. Vary the sequence so you become used to the thrust after any other stroke. She shuffled down the hall, her light slippers whispering on the boards. Then, with every 3rd stroke, she stamped her right foot forward and lunged, point down, and cutting edge uppermost. Maikeru let her reach the far end of the hall before he called out, "Now back again." The tapping of the rod on the boards became more rapid, and Cassandra moved toward them, the katana like a striking snake. Cut, cut, slash, thrust. Cut, cut, sweep, thrust. She stopped in front of him, and he nodded approvingly. "Now try it with Damon-san." Damon held out a hand, protesting. "But I'll know she's going to do it every 3rd stroke." Maikeru smiled grimly. "But only she will know when those 3 strokes begin," he said. Damon nodded his understanding. They assumed their ready positions, and Maikeru once more called for them to begin. This time, Damon struck first, aiming an overhead blow at Cassandra. Her wooden blade flickered out, and she deflected his stroke so that the practiced sword rebounded from the floorboards, throwing him slightly off balance. Seizing her opportunity, Cassandra delivered a barrage of cuts, slashes, and sweeps. Then, after 6 of these, she suddenly lunged, one-handed. Damon only just managed to recoil away from the tip of her blade, stumbling slightly, but bringing his shield up to block the thrust. Once more, she began to cut and slash at him. This time, she waited 4 strokes, then lunged. But he was ready. His shield caught her sword and deflected it away from him. Then, as she was still leaning forward, unbalanced and open to his reply, his sword flashed forward and struck her on the outer thigh. They stepped back. It had been a winning blow. In a real fight, it would not have killed her outright. But even if it hadn't severed any of the major blood vessels in her leg, it would have taken her right leg out from under her and left her at his mercy. "Again," Maikeru said quietly, and once more the hall responded with the rapid impacts of wood on wood. Then Cassandra essayed another thrust, with the same result. Damon's shield blocked her katana, his sword whipped out and caught her on the hip. Cassandra stepped back, her cheeks flaming with effort and frustration. She rubbed her left hand against her hip. There would be a bruise there tonight, she realized. "This is hopeless," she said angrily. Maikeru regarded her with a half-smile. "You think so?" "I know so," she replied, still angry. "The thrust leaves me open to a reply, as you said, and Damon has no trouble avoiding it. Why bother with such a useless tactic?" Maikeru turned his impassive gaze to Damon. "You noticed?" When the young captain nodded, Maikeru indicated Cassandra. "Tell her." "You're signaling the thrust," Damon said, apologetically. "I know when you're going to try it." He paused, then elaborated. "Actually, I didn't know the first time, but after that it was obvious." What was so blasted obvious? Cassandra knew it wasn't fair to vent her anger on a subordinate like Damon. He couldn't respond in kind. Nonetheless, her quick temper overcame her sense of fairness. "Before you thrust, you raise your chin slightly," Damon told her. She drew breath for a heated reply, then realized he might be right. She looked at Maikeru for confirmation, and the gray-haired swordmaster nodded. "Every time," he said. "It's a habit you'll have to break. Otherwise, it could cost you your life." Cassandra considered his words, glanced at Damon, and nodded. "Thanks," she said. "I'll have to work on that." All right, that is going to conclude Chapter 11. Thank you all for joining me, and I will look forward to seeing you all next time in Chapter 12. God bless, and have a good one.